Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. And actually, I must remind myself how long we're expecting the total session to last.
Around an hour from now, Ben.
About an hour from now. Okay, that's right. Yeah. So this is a sort of outline page, just to say that bog and wet heath fine scale habitats. We'll be looking at three of them: blanket bog, raised bog, and wet heath. And we'll be looking at similarities between them and differences. And we can move on to the next one. That's the outline slide there. It's in the same style. We can change the slide as well now. Yeah. That I'll wait for it to move on to the next slide. Sometimes there's a bit of a delay, I know, with this. There we are. That was the same style as the template thing that Rachel sent me. I'd already made a beginning page in similar format to the ones in previous years, which is basically saying the same thing and repeats that bit of blurb that I put that came out in the advert thing for this session, in which I'd written a bit of a silly poem at the end of it. I don't know, sometimes you hear a few words and you think, hey, I'll make a wee rhyme out of that. It could be about anything. It could be about mosses or something like that. In this case, peatland habitats. So as I've written at the bottom there, there'll be a lot of overlap between what's in this session and the one I did last year and the year before for MPMS, which was titled Bog and Wet Heath, in which we were looking at the habitat as a whole and the three fine scale habitats within it. So in that sense, there's kind of like about 100% overlap. So what I've done is just try to perhaps be a bit more focused on the differences between the fine scale habitats, and at the very least put in some different photographs like this one of blanket bog and wet heath in the Outer Hebrides. Blanket bog dominated landscape there, so some bits of differences, but there will inevitably be a lot of overlap, and some of the photos from the previous one are repeated in here as well. Maybe some of you hadn't seen the previous one, I don't know. We can move on to the next slide, I think, now.
Just to note there, I have just popped the link to your previous webinar in the chat box if anybody would like to see that as well for the extra information.
This one, I suppose this one could sort of supersede that one in a way. Yeah, as I said, the problem there's the problem. Obviously, it's not that negative. It's is that there are a lot of species in common. So the vegetation can look very, very similar in all three of these fine scale habitat types. But good news is that they're not like calcareous grasslands or something where there's zillions of species. There's much smaller number of species, especially the main species and the more telling species. So there are not that many to have to grapple with, and they have a lot of species in common. And before I say what those are, which is kind of what I was going to do, and I thought, hey, put that as a question, because some questions are part of what these things are about. There's only a few questions in this presentation. So this question here, it's not like a question that if you don't give the answer, we can't proceed any further, but just asked in a more casual way, what kind of species, what plant species do blanket bog, raised bog, and wet heath have in common? And we're talking only about vascular plants and the ones that are really common enough to form a significant amount of the total cover. So there's only half a dozen of them. So what could they be? Just a wee moment for you all just to have a think about, and some of you might know straight away what they all are, and others not. It doesn't matter. That's why we're doing the session. So we can move on now to the page with the answer. What's the answer? It sounds a bit like question answer, as if it's, I don't know. But no, here are six plant species that are significant in all three of those fine scale habitats: blanket bog, raised bog, and wet heath. Heather on the left, hugely common species throughout. It can be, in some of them, it can be the most abundant species. It's consistently really common. Cross-leaved heath, likewise, easy to identify with those little greyish leaves with the hairs on them, and clusters of pale pink flowers. Deer grass, trichophorum with its straight stems and little little clusters of flowers, and the whole thing goes a golden colour later in the year. I think we've got some photos later on that will show that golden colour a bit better. Purple moorgrass, which starts off green and then goes that buff colour later in the year, as we're seeing there, with long flower heads, and it's very tussocky, distinctive grass, easy to identify. Common cotton grass, that's the one with the multiple heads and the leaves that are like so many kinds of sedge leaves. There's a photograph a bit later on, a more close view of that species, and comparing it to another cotton grass. And bog myrtle, which looks like a kind of little willow a bit. There's a closer picture of some of the leaves of bog myrtle a bit later on. Distinctive things, got reddish stems and resin scented leaves, so it's unlike little willows in those respects. So we can move on to the next one, I think.
Before I do, Ben, Anna's just asked, what about Eriophorum vaginatum? Is that common too?
Yeah.
She's asking. Yeah.
Good question. That's funnily enough, that one is coming up on the very next page. The reason why I've separated it and not put it in this first list is because it's not common to all three of the fine scale habitats, because one of those fine scale habitats is wet heath, and hairtail cotton grass is a bog plant. So if we go on to the next one, here we are. So, because otherwise one might think, oh yeah, so every example of any one of those fine scale habitats will have a fair amount of at least one of those species on that previous page. Not necessarily, because you can get some kind of bogs in which hairtail cotton grass is actually the dominant, and in which those species on the previous page are either absent or extremely scarce, so it's extremely sparse. So hairtail cotton grass, really important species in this whole thing about separating the fine scale habitats, because it's a bog plant, and we don't find it in wet heaths, or if we ever do find it in a wet heath or a dry heath or some other kind of vegetation that's not a bog, it'll only be one or two tussocks, be very, very sparse. So it's an easy thing to identify, these quite big, dense tussocks of thin, wiry leaves of a dull green colour, turning pale, dull greyish brown later in the year. And it's the one that's got the single white cottony heads, not the multiple ones of common cotton grass. The flowers are funny things, that greyish colour early in the season. It's a very early flower, comes out when it's still pretty cold. So yeah, common cotton grass, very hairtail cotton grass, very important species. And on the next page, we've got a photo of some of that kind of bog in which hairtail cotton grass is the most common vascular plant species, and in which those other things, the heather and the crossleaf heath and so on, are either not there at all, or if there's anything, there's just titchy little bits. So that's why we can't say that those first 6 species, that some of them will be in every example of all of those fine scale habitats, because wet heath will never have the hairtail cotton grass, and some bog will be just dominated by the hairtail cotton grass at the expense of the other ones. It was probably a more heathery bog before it was grazed more, and the dwarf shrubs, certainly heather and various, so well, crossleaf heath isn't so palatable, but heather is very palatable, and bog myrtle quite palatable as well. So we can, if we go on to the next slide, we can see some bog that's probably like what the last one would have looked like before it was more grazed. So it's mainly hairtail cotton grass and heather. This kind of bog is very, very common in places that aren't too heavily grazed, and it's kind of at the naturally drier end of range of variation among bogs, because as we'll see in some subsequent photos, there are other kinds of bog which have more of a mix of different kinds of vascular species and more species of sphagnum moss, and reflecting the wetter conditions. The next page actually is an example of that. It's these 2 bogs are in Northern Ireland, this one and the last one, by the way. So here we got a rather more of a mixture of things. There's some there's heather, as there is always, usually at least some, and crossleaf heath. There's some flowering old flowers of bog asphodel, and purple moorgrass, common cotton grass in there as well. Quite a mix of things. This is a much wetter bog, and you can see some sphagnum. The vascular cover in the wetter bogs tends to be a bit more opened out a bit more, which gives more room for the sphagnum mosses. Sometimes you can get some open water on the peat. So yeah, I've arrowed in that ochre coloured moss, that sphagnum bit that you can see in the lower part of the picture, because it's quite an important species. And if we go on to the next page, we've got some closer views of that. It's a moss called Sphagnum papillosum. I know the MPMS doesn't actually, strictly speaking, deal with mosses, but when we're actually just looking at the habitat point of view from telling you that one habitat type or another, mosses do come into it. And there's just a small number of plant species that are really good indicators of bogs because they occur there and not occurring, or only very rarely, sparsely occurring in wet heath. Obviously, the hare's tail cotton grass is one of them. It's the main one, really. But this moss, Sphagnum papillosum, likewise, it's very much a bog species. Here and there, you can find it in some of the wetter wet heaths. Not much of it in there, though. It's mainly a bog plant, and it's quite distinctive. And it's one of those sphagnums that has got very thick, stubby branches, because the branch leaves are quite big and concave. Other kinds of sphagnums got much thinner branches, much finer, and the ochre colour is reasonably consistent. Sometimes it goes a bit greener. There's some green bits in some of that moss there, but fairly consistently ochre colour, nice colour, and a big sphagnum. So that's a very good bog indicator. And on the next page, we've got a sphagnum that is similar in its build. That's the photo on the left. Another big, chunky kind of sphagnum. It looks a bit like the Sphagnum papillosum has been dipped in some red dye. And what we used to call that was Sphagnum magellanicum, and it's very much a bog plant again. It's been split into different species now. Sphagnum magellanicum, in a strict sense, is not known in Britain. It's down in South America. Our plants are of two species, Sphagnum medium and Sphagnum divinum. By far the greater amount of it seems to be Sphagnum medium. It's only a recent split. So either way, whichever one it is, if you see that kind of big red sphagnum, it's likely to be bog. That's not to confuse it with what we could call the small red sphagnum photo on the right, that's Sphagnum capillifolium, which is extremely common, just as common as papillosum and magellanicum in the bogs. But it also grows in wet heaths and wet woods and all sorts of other kinds of wet, generally acid places. So Sphagnum capillifolium, even though it's very common in bogs, it's not a bog indicator. Patches of Sphagnum capillifolium can be just as big as those of the Sphagnum medium. But when we say it's small rather than a big one, we're talking about the size of the branch leaves, which makes the branches very, very thin, and they're quite short as well. And the heads, what we call the capitulum, the top, those flowery looking heads on the top of the shoot, they're smaller as well. So more of a sort of fine scale kind of sphagnum in that sense. Okay, so we can move on to the next page now that we've looked at some major floristic differences between bog vegetation and wet heath vegetation. And when I say bog vegetation and wet heath vegetation, this is kind of in a way that aligns with, as I said there, with the NVC, where it's all based on plant communities as opposed to their habitat, like how deep the peat is or anything. It's all a classification based entirely on floristic things. And somebody's just put in there, is there ever an absence of sphagnums in drier bog? Yes, there can be. And we would still call it bog. Say if we've got a bog that's maybe it's got a lot of heather and a lot of hare's tail cotton grass. If there's an abundance of hare's tail cotton grass, then without question we say that's a bog, because it is. And we might go in there hunting around for some sphagnum and not find any. Chances are, if that happens, it's a bog that's been dried out a bit by some combination of burning or draining. and it may be kind of drying out on its way, maybe eventually, in fact, to continue to turn into some kind of heath, even a dry heath. There's some photos a bit later that show something that seems to be in that kind of stage. So we can do, yeah, if it's got a little hairtail cotton grass in it, then we're still calling it bog. We don't have to find sphagnum for it to be a bog, or a wet heath either. You get wet heath without sphagnum. Okay, so that's it. That's in the plant community sense. What I also we moved on to the next page, but well, I'm just going to say something that was on the previous page. That doesn't matter. We can stick with the slide on this page. If you find vegetation that is bog vegetation, in that it's got a lot of hairtail cotton grass in it and a lot of Sphagnum papillosum or marginal or medium, so that we're saying it's definitely bog vegetation, like in the MVC sense, especially. But we stick a thing in the ground and we find that the peat is less than 50 centimeters deep, which might appear to be at odds with the fact that people tend to say bog is on peat that's more than 50 centimeters deep. It can be less sometimes. So pardon me, if we find bog vegetation on a shallower peat, it's still bog. It's important to still call it bogs. What else would we call it? You really wouldn't call it a heath if it stick with things like Areophorus vaginatum, the hairtail cotton grass. Conversely, if we find vegetation that's obviously either a bog or a wet heath, but it can't be a bog because it doesn't have a load of hairtail cotton grass or those sphagnum species, particular sphagnums in it. So then we look at it and we say, well, we have to call that wet heath vegetation, which is fine. It's not like we have to call it as if it's a problem. But even though wet heath is mostly on a shallower peat, if we find that in this particular location we're talking about that the wet heath is deeper than 50 centimeters, it was probably once bog and has got a bit drier. So in those cases, which are in the minority very much, we would actually call it in NPMS terms bog. So there is a bit of a peat depth element in it as well, but for the most part, vegetation is definitely the best way to make these separations. In this picture here, it's an example of the kind of bog that some people might look at and think, what, is that a bog? I would have thought it was a heath because it's got so much heather in it. Some of these bogs, the ones that are naturally at the drier end, can be just so full of heather. But, you know, you're looking at there's an abundance of hairtail cotton grass, so it is bog. And we go on to the next picture, which shows some bog that's a bit more obviously bog. It's just upslope of where this is actually in Aberdeenshire. That's probably what people might more expect bog to look like, but they're both bog. This is a wetter bog, so there's more of a mix, including deer grass and more sphagnums in there as well. Not such a great quantity of heather, and this has got some bog pools in it as well, so it's quite classic appearance of some bog. And then we can go on to the next picture as well, which shows something similar, but in the West Highlands. That one was in the east, and this is an even wetter place here. So we've got bog pools and bigger spreads of sphagnum mosses in there. So it's and you can see the flowering heads of the hare's tail cotton grass through the middle of the picture there. So classic wet bog with the whole mix of heather, cross-leaved heath, and deer grass, and purple moor grass, and sphagnums. So the next picture will show us a view. Actually, at the bottom there, we've got a picture of a view in some raised bog, because all those photos that we've seen of bog, I haven't actually said whether they were blanket or raised. They were actually blanket bog. The vegetation, the reason I didn't specify the blanket bog was because I didn't want to give the impression that there's some kind of big vegetation difference between blanket bog and raised bog. The vegetation of those two fine-scale habitats, blanket bog and raised bog, is more or less the same, but the topography is a bit different in the raised bog. It's a kind of broad, shallow dome, which can be so broad and flat when you're in the middle of it that you wouldn't, looking at that photograph, for example, you wouldn't look at that and think, oh, we're on a dome. It doesn't look like a dome, it just looks like some flat place. You only see it's a dome when you get to the very edges. And there will be some photos of that in a wee while. The next picture shows a couple of species plants that are actually quite a lot more common in general on raised bogs than on blanket bogs. And I know I just said that there's no real floristic difference between blanket bogs and raised bogs, that they have basically the same kind of vegetation. That is true, but these two species are more common on raised bogs, but not consistently. So you can't sort of find a bit of cranberry or bog rosemary and say, oh, it's got to be a raised bog because he's there, because you can find them here and there in blanket bogs as well. The bog rosemary, by the way, is another species that really is a pretty good bog indicator in the general bog sense, because you tend not to find it in wet heaths, and not very much in non-bog vegetation. So it's, but the reason why I didn't say that earlier is because it's got a much more restricted distribution than the hairtail cotton grass and those two big sphagnum species. It's like it's very rare north of the Solway Firth area, really. And there's some sites for it in the Central Belt in Scotland, but it's really very rare that far north, and there's one or two places in the Highlands but extremely rare. And down south it's a bit more of a restricted distribution pattern as well, more localized. So in the general total UK sense, it's not quite so useful as a sort of widespread bog indicator. But within its range, if you do find it, you're much more likely to be on bog than wet heath. So the next slides have got some general, more kind of landscape views of raised bog. Here, this is a place in West Lothian, where you can see that bit of a slope there between the low ground on the left. There's this outer low zone, which is called the lag, and then the sloping sides of the bog called the rand, and then you can see the flatter upper part on the right, part of the main bog surface itself. The vegetation of the rand tends to be some kind of bog vegetation as well. It might be similar to what's on the main part of the bog, or slightly different. It's usually a kind of bog vegetation though, rather than something like a wet heath. The vegetation in the lag zone is much more of a mix. It can include bits of bog vegetation, but as here, we've got some rush mires in there. You can get rush mires, sedge mires, wet woodland, and it can be more kind of mineral enriched with stuff that's come in from the outside. It's a kind of very shallow depression, really, that goes right around the edge of the raised bog. The next photo has another example of raised bog, again in the Scottish Central Belt, where the sort of slope that goes down between the main part of the bog and the lag is so gentle. It's very, very, very slight. But the lag zone there, it's got a lot of rushy stuff and wet woodland, willows and birches. You can even get fens in the lag zone. But the vegetation in front of us here on the main part of the bog, look, as you can see, it looks so similar to what we'd seen in some of those blanket bog photographs. It's heather, cross-leaved heath, hairtail cotton grass. There's some yellow flowers of bog asphodel and some sphagnums. That looks like Sphagnum papillosum in the foreground, that ochre colour. Basically the same kind of thing. The next photo is another example of another little raised bog. It looks quite big, but it's quite small as some raised bogs go. This is one near Edinburgh. Nice little place, this nature reserve. Red moss of Balerno. It's quite a heathery one, this. It looks a bit like some of those heathery versions of blanket bog, composed mostly of heather and hairtail cotton grass. So very similar vegetation. And it's not like all of these raised bogs are chock-a-block full of cranberry and bog rosemary, by the way, as well, because when we're on a raised bog, we might well be looking for those. This far north, near Edinburgh, there's hardly any chance of finding bog rosemary unless you're at one or two specific places where it does grow. And even cranberry can be rare or absent from some raised bogs. So you can have vegetation in this kind of place that's just exactly the same as you find in a lot of blanket bog. But these photos also show the general setting. See, it's some fields, there's some hills in the distance, but it's fields and trees, kind of farmland, especially pasture kind of landscape in which the raised bog is set. And if we go on to the next slide, there's a map I've drawn which shows the main distributions of the blanket bog and the raised bog in Britain and Ireland. So it's quite fitting that we find raised bogs mostly in that kind of setting amongst pasture, fields and woods, because they're in lowlands, more sort of agricultural enclosed lowlands, whereas the blanket bogs tend to be out in more unenclosed upland areas among heaths and various kinds of mires, acid grasslands. When I say upland areas, you'll see that that map goes right down to the coast in the northwest, sort of West Scotland and the islands. That's because it's upland in the climatic sense. It's sort of cool and wet climate. That's really where the blanket bog occurs, in areas with a cool and wet climate. So they go right down to sea level in the far northwest. So yeah, different parts of the country. There's not a huge amount of overlap in the distributions of those two, of the raised and the blanket bogs, but you get little bits of overlap there, and there's tiny bits of raised bog here and there within the upland areas, but not very much. The next slide has a picture. This is a very sorry sight, when you see a bog that's been stripped of its peat and its vegetation. And it's terrible that they're still allowed to do that. How it is with someone who's got some license from decades ago and they're saying it's still valid. I don't think it should be allowed. Anyway, this is where this usually raised bogs where this happens. Perhaps that's not surprising, because the depth of peat can be very great, and they tend to be nearer to the centres of population and distribution for their products. So it's in that kind of lowland agricultural setting we can come across these. That's one in North Cumbria. A few years ago I was there doing some survey. You might think there's nothing to survey. There were bits in the middle that hadn't been cut, fortunately, some bits, and some other bits of lag zone around the edge that were quite interesting. That's what I was there to look at. Okay, the next slide has a bit of raised bog in an upland setting, and you can see how it's not so clear there, because in the lowland setting it's all completely different vegetation outside the area of the bog. In an upland setting it's less clear. There can even be other bits of bog. You can have blanket bog very, very close to those bits of raised bog that occur in the upland areas. So they're much more diffuse, not at all so obviously raised. This is an example in the southern uplands of Scotland, in a generally heathy sort of landscape, but there was a bit of a lag zone with a rushmire around the edge. And the next photo has an interesting one in that it looks like any old bit of rather grassy kind of blanket bog. There's a lot of purple moorgrass in that one, and this is quite grazed. And in that bog there, which is down in the far south of Scotland, there was an awful lot of cranberry and bog rosemary, which is mainly a raised bog species, and occurs very commonly in the raised bogs around the Solway Firth, but also just getting a little bit away from the coast into what was just about more what you would describe as blanket bog in the topographic sense, and it was the same kind of vegetation. So a slightly unusual example in that it was blanket bog that really was just about adjoining some fields as well, that kind of almost looking like it was in that raised bog kind of landscape, but the topography of the bog itself and how its edges came to join up with other things was better described there as blanket bog. So sometimes you can get what they call intermediate bogs. Some classifications, the UK Biodiversity Action Plan, I think it has one. We did some surveys for the Forestry Commission. They were using UK BAP quite a lot, and that had an intermediate bog category. So that if you were in a situation perhaps like this one, where you thought, which one do we call this? You could go for that, but trying to keep that to a minimum. Obviously, in NPMS there isn't an intermediate bog one, so you have to just decide. Okay, the next picture shows some bog. This is an example of bog that's on a slope that's steeper than what most people would think bog would exist on. This is obviously the more dry end of bogs, again, heather and hairtail cotton grass dominant. And we find this in these upland areas where, especially in the north, occasionally on north-facing slopes in the north, where everything's sort of very cool and humid. So they can even be a slope that's so sufficiently steep that the steepness combined with the tussocky-ness of the vegetation is such that if you're walking up it, you've got to be hauling yourself up there, and you're thinking, yeah, bloody hell, this is quite a job doing this. And you're thinking, but this is bog. People think bogs are flat. You just walk about on them. Well, you walk about, or maybe you sink. But hauling yourself up a slope on a bog, it's quite interesting. Next picture shows bog that's been hagged. We find this in especially in watershed situations, quite high up, but also places where animals like deer have got in quite a lot. I think maybe in watersheds. Somebody said there, how do we tell the steep heavily bog from wet heath? Yeah, the reason how we tell that's bog is because it's got a lot of hairtail cotton grass in it. That's how we tell it from the heath. So this one, some degree of hagging might be a natural thing in some of the more exposed watershed situations. What's another thing? Oh, many thanks. That's okay. You're welcome. In these watershed situations, but it could be exacerbated by the activities of deer in big numbers, or sheep as well. This is an example in the southern uplands, but you can also see good depth of peat in such places. The next photo, speaking of water on the surface, some bog pools. Bog pools are a common feature in both raised bog and blanket bog, especially blanket bogs, really. These are blanket bogs, these photos here. Some of the bog pools have got a lot of sphagnum, moss in them, different kinds of sphagnum. And some of them are quite thick with the common cotton grass, about which I said I would show you a photo a bit later of its closer view of its leaves. There we have one at the far right. It's slightly blurry, but you can see that there's a kind of groove running up the middle of the leaf, as you find in lots of species of sedge, the genus Carex, because they've got a kind of V-shaped profile. In that sense, it's a very ordinary looking leaf, except that quite a few centimeters back from the tip of the leaf, that groove suddenly finishes, and beyond that groove, it's like it's all filled in, so it's a triangular solid leaf tip. Immediately identifies it. Very, very distinctive. Okay, next photo has a photograph of some bigger bog pools. If you get bog pools that are as big as this, you're probably on a blanket bog. They tend to be a more limited size on raised bogs. And this is one that's bigger and deeper as well, too deep to be really that sort of thickly filled in with sphagnum. And it's got a lot of bog bean in it. We find a lot of these in the far north, in places like Sutherland and Wester Ross, the Outer Hebrides. So the next photo has some bog, bit like one of the first photos I showed, where it was bog that was mostly hairtail cotton grass, that kind of green bog. And in this photo, a little bit of a closer view of it, we can see that between the tussocks, we got a lot of that green sphagnum. Closer picture of it there on the right, Sphagnum phalanx. This is a moss that does naturally occur in bogs, both raised and blanket bogs, but not that much. It's actually about our commonest species of sphagnum in Britain. It likes all kinds of wet, acid places, wet woods, wet heaths, mires, sedge mires, rush mires, and so on, all kinds of things. So you might think it'd be common in bogs too, but it's surprisingly sparse in bogs unless they've been affected in some way by, especially grazing and the trampling that goes along with it. It seems to be able to take off from that at the expense of other sphagnums that have been lost, like Sphagnum capillifolium and papillosum. And the moss at the bottom right, Polytrichum commune, great big things with a starry look to it and opaque, stiff leaves that look like miniature conifer needles. That comes in, okay, naturally might be little bits of it in a bog, but not very much at all, even though it's such a hugely common species in Britain as a whole in wet acid places. But in the more trampled and grazed bogs, that also thickens up big time. So there's a couple of species, if we see those mosses in abundance, something's probably been going on. Probably sheep and deer have been involved somewhere, being right there. Okay, next picture. You know, I said that there were some blanket bogs that, or any kinds of bog, blanket or raised, that that can be as if they're on their way out to become a heath of some kind because they've been getting drier, probably because of burning or draining. Well, here's some examples. It's more obviously bog on the right hand side of the top photo, and then going into a heath on the left. It's actually just a dry heath because it's mostly heather. You know, hasn't got the things like deer grass and purple moorgrass in it. It's fairly abrupt boundary there, but the one below is a little bit more gradual. So there's much more thinly scattered hare's tail cotton grass. You can see with the white dots of the cottony heads growing amongst what's otherwise looking almost like pure heather. And in those kinds of places, the blanket bog can grade out to gradually to a heath that is a dry heath, not a wet heath. So it goes straight from, if you imagine a bog of mainly heather and hare's tail cotton grass, and maybe mosses including Sphagnum capillifolium that doesn't have to be in bogs. If you've got that kind of mix, it's a bog. And if you take the hare's tail cotton grass out of it, you're left with the heather and the Sphagnum capillifolium and probably a few other common mosses of other kinds. And it'll be a dry heath because you haven't got the deer grass, purple moorgrass, the cross-leaved heath, and the bog myrtle, those things. So that shows how you can go straight from bog into a dry heath. Next picture is this is some raised bog, and purple moorgrass has become dominant in the foreground, not in the background. It's more heathery, more typical bog vegetation in the background, but this foreground stuff has actually been dominated by purple moorgrass, and this tends to happen in places where there's been some combination of burning and grazing. If it's being grazed, the heather tends to dwindle because heather is very palatable. The purple moorgrass is not really so palatable, although animals will eat it early in the season, but then it becomes a bit tough and fibrous a bit later on. They tend to leave it more. Also, if it's been burned, the purple moorgrass tussocks, the lower parts of those tussocks can somehow survive burning a little bit better than some of the other bog species, and it can come up again in even over the years in more abundance, because if the other things have been suppressed, then there's more room for the millennia, the purple moorgrass, to grow. So it can become the dominant species on some areas that were more heathery before, and that can be in both bogs and wet heaths. It can be bogs that are raised or blanket, or in wet heaths we can get this purple moorgrass dominant vegetation, which here on this on the deep peat, purple moorgrass dominated stuff on a deep peat will be classed as bog, in this case raised bog. So last page of bogs coming up. There's just a quick recap thing. I could have put bullet points in there. I thought I'd draw some squiggly lines just for fun. And well, it's a great thing to do, draw squiggly lines. You never know what you're going to do on the next one. Best indicator species, we've seen them there, hare's tail cotton grass and those two mosses. But we can note, I didn't write it in here, but we can note about the bog rosemary if we're in the geographical zone of it, and especially if we're in raised bogs. The bog vegetation type is the vegetation is irrespective of the peat depth. But if it's wet heath vegetation or millennia dominated vegetation that happens to be on deep peat, then we swing it into the NPMS bog habitat as well. It's worth noting that in this presentation, because I don't think I made that point in the one a couple of years ago. Raised bog, a gentle dome topography, blanket bog, more gently undulating, not like that purple squiggly line, obviously. And without a clear lag zone. So that's we can go on next one to wet heaths, starting to talk about wet heaths. And I'm going to be off for time. I don't want to drag this on too long. So a lot of the species are shared, but we don't have hare's tail cotton grass or those two big sphagnums. And here's a fairly typical area of wet heath with a lot of heather and deer grass and some purple moorgrass. You can see its tall flowering heads in the lower left. The next picture has a big extent of it, as we see very often in the West Highlands, which is really has the greatest amount of wet heath in Britain, is in the Scottish Highlands in general, especially in the West, including the islands. Huge expanses of it going on, varying from flattish ground up to moderate slopes, mostly on these shallower peats. You can see how it's shallower because there's rock outcrops among them there. In the foreground, it's very much heather dominated with no sign of other the wet heath species, so it'll be a bit of dry heath in the foreground, but all that stuff beyond wet heath is hugely extensive in these parts. Further south in Britain, much less extensive, unless you're in Galloway. There's a lot of it there. Next slide has got a few views of wet heath, combinations of these species, and oh yes, I'll whiz through these a bit faster, these wet heath ones, because there's one next week. It's on Monday, looking specifically at wet heath, so I can afford to whiz through these little bits, especially as I've probably been rambling on a bit about bogs, taking up more time. So on the left is one that's dominated mainly by heather and purple moorgrass. We see a lot of wet heath like this, lots, especially the further south you go. I tend to see more deer grass further north. As a general rule, there's a lot of overlap. So the one in the middle, mainly heather and deer grass. Especially if you're on a slightly drier kind of wet heath, you'll tend to have more deer grass. If you've got a sort of more compacted peat surface, deer grass likes that. And another kind of view that we get of it is with lots and lots of cross-leaved heath. More of that than we have of the graminoids. And somebody said, if there's no Aerophon vaginatum but a wee bit of sphagnum, is it still wet heath? If there was if there's no Aerophon vaginatum and just a wee bit of sphagnum, if there was no Aerophon vaginatum, it's not going to be a bog. And if you don't have those bog sphagnums, it shouldn't be a bog either. If there's a wee bit of sphagnum, just a wee bit of sphagnum, yeah, I think we'd call it, your description would be wet heath. Yep, you're right. No Aerophon vaginatum and just a wee bit of sphagnum, wet heath. Yeah. I think you said no Aerophon vaginatum, because the chat box thing went after a few seconds. I was trying to remember which way was it. Yeah. Okay, let's go on to the next. But as you can see from those, that's a huge difference in appearance, especially the right-hand one with loads of cross-leaved heath. Very different, all three very different looks. And the next slide is another one again, very different appearance, because we're going to see a whole load of bog myrtle. There we are. And there's a close-up picture of those leaves that look a bit like willow leaves, especially grey willow, because they're slightly wider towards the upper half of the leaf, above the middle. But they've got these funny little teeth, just a few teeth, and they're rather widely spaced. And they have that beautiful smell, resin kind of smell, and reddish stems. It's nothing like it. It's a beautiful plant, bog myrtle. Very common in some of the wet heath, especially on the slightly deeper soils, wet heath, and in bogs. Next picture, yet another view of wet heaths. This is fairly ordinary stuff that could look like bog, you know, in that kind of view, but there's a lack of hairtail cotton grass, and you don't get those two big sphagnums. Instead, there's a lot of heather, cross-leaved heath, deer grass, purple moorgrass, those things in there. So the next picture has more of a summer view. That last one was winter half of the year. Here we are in lowland. I've got just a very few pictures of lowland wet heath because most of my work's been in upland areas, and I've hardly managed. I'm looking forward to seeing some more lowland wet heaths in due course. This one down south, it's mainly cross-leaved heath and purple moorgrass. So again, it's flat. So from a distance, and that kind of general coloration, you might think, is that a bog, but definitely not. No hairtail cotton grass, and none of those big sphagnums. Next picture shows coastal wet heath. Little patchy bits of it along the coast, not far from here actually, with lots of cross-leaved heath and some heather here and there too. It's not that common wet heath in coastal places, but it does occur. Next one again has some wet heath down south with some western gorse growing in it. And there's some more gorse pictures a bit later on. One more gorse picture with the 3 gorses on it to show the differences between them. But yeah, it's got a load of purple moorgrass growing there, with its pale flowering stems, the longer stems, and cross-leaved heath lots of that. So that tells us it's wet heath. Again, no hairtail cotton grass, none of those big sphagnums, so it's wet heath. But it looks quite different with all that yellow gorse. Next picture has got the same species of gorse, but not quite in the flowering time. So it looks pretty dull and green. But the cross-leaved heath is showing very, very prominently there in such an abundance that combined with the Molinia leaves that you can see quite a few of them, the leaves and the flowering stems poking up through the gorse, that you say, yeah, that's wet heath, rather than the dry heath, because the western gorse can be in wet heaths and in dry heaths. Here it's a wet heath. Okay, next picture, a bit more variation within wet heaths. It looks quite ordinary in a way, deer grass, and cross-leaved heath and heather and so on, but there's tufts of black bogrush. The black refers to the little black blobby flower heads at the tips of the shoots. Otherwise, they look quite pale. The stems and the leaves can be quite pale, as you can see there. Tufty thing. It likes base enrichments where there's flushing. So it's in a little bit of flushed wet heath there in the Outer Hebrides. And the next picture shows effects of grazing and burning. This applies to wet heath as much as it does to bogs, and dry heath too. Someone's asked what key difference is wet and dry heath, if western gorse can be in both. Yeah, in the wet heath, this is something that I haven't actually kind of particularly focused on in this presentation, because it's been more to do with how to tell wet heath from bogs, if we're telling wet heath from anything. But how to tell wet heath from dry heath? Well, you see some of those species we had at the beginning: cross-leaved heath, deer grass, purple moorgrass, and bog myrtle. Those four. If you're in a wet heath, there's got to be at least one of those four species in good quantity, or it might be 2 or 3 of them in reasonable quantities, so that collectively they're a significant part of the vegetation. That is always going to be the case in wet heath. In dry heath, you don't get that. So you might have a titchy bit of deer grass, titchy bit of purple moorgrass, like that, but only as a really minor, insignificant component of vegetation, which would probably otherwise be mostly things like heather, bell heather, blaeberry, bilberry, we call it blaeberry in Scotland, those kind of things. So it's those species to look for if we're separating wet and dry heaths. There's deer grass, purple moorgrass, cross-leaved heath, and bog myrtle. That group is well represented in wet heath, not in the dry heath. And as the western gorse can be in both of those. On the left here, it's the grazing's taken out a lot of the dwarf shrub growth, so we're left with mostly deer grass. On the right, patch burning for more grouse moor management, not the best thing in my view. And you can see the effect it's had. Grazing is obviously not too heavy, so there's a lot of ericoid dwarf shrubs, a lot of heather around, and then cross-leaved heath is doing very well in the foreground. But even though it's not so grazed, there are other aspects of the vegetation that do suffer from that burning. Things like the amount of sphagnum mosses, the diversity of mosses and liverworts, diversity of dwarf shrub species. So burning does definitely affect the dry heath, and the burning can eventually turn to affect the wet heath. And the burning is one of the things that can contribute to blanket bog vegetation on a deep peat becoming wet heath vegetation, or purple moorgrass, or even a dry heath. Burning and draining do that. Okay, next picture has got some close-up views of some of these plant species we can find in the wet heaths. And in bogs as well, some of the bogs, except bell heather on the left is very rare in bogs because it likes dry ground. On the whole, it's mainly a dry heath species, but it can occur in towards the drier end of wet heaths, very rare in bogs. Bilberry, blaeberry, and cowberry and crowberry, these other shrubs that can be scattered through any of them, through the wet heaths and the bogs. The cowberry and the crowberry a bit more in bogs than in wet heaths. There can be, suffice to say, there can be quite a range, quite a diversity of dwarf shrubs in wet heaths and bogs. And the next photo is looking at a bit more variation in wet heath. So these are relatively dry examples of wet heath in that they've got mainly heather and deer grass, and in the case of the one on the left, lots of cladonia lichens. They tend to do a bit better in the drier examples of wet heath, though they can be also common in bogs, but this is obviously a wet heath, hasn't got hairtail cotton grass and so on. And it's also got bits of bell heather in it as well. And the one on the right is similar, except instead of having a load of lichens, the cladonia lichens, it's got little clumps of, or quite big clumps of that greyish green moss called Racemitrium lanuginosum. So those are typical rather drier wet heaths in the highlands. Lots of deer grass, mainly deer grass and heather in both cases. And the next slide, not too far from the end really now, is asking a question: what do you make of this? Like, what I mean, say, by what do you make of it? What do you think it would be in NPMS habitat terms? And I've made a comment there that the dwarf shrubs are heather and bell heather. It's on the Isle of Skye. I should see what the...
this isn't a test. Just this is an opportunity to have a little bit of a think. So please do feel free to add any thoughts into the chat box there.
So it'd be a case of looking at what I've said there, that there's heather and bell heather in there. You can see some of the flowers. The bell heather flowers are bigger than the heather flowers, and because this is in the autumn, the flowers have gone over and they turn that pale brown color for both species. And then there are other plants in there. There's some like graminoids being grasses, sedges, rushing and stuff. And so we can't see any moss in there, can we? It's just the graminoids. So people are putting some thoughts in there about plant species, I can see. Dry heath, question mark, lacking tetralyx. I think there is indeed rather a lack of Erica tetralyx, the cross-leaved heath. Or if there is, it'd be quite sparse. I hadn't actually looked at that picture specifically for in terms of the abundance of Erica tetralyx. But obviously there wouldn't be very much. If there is any, it will be not very much. Someone says a fair bit of Molinia. I guess we can go on to the next page, which gives us an answer. It's actually bog, believe it or not, because even though it's got bell heather in it there, because the graminoid species in it was, as somebody had quite rightly reckoned, the hairtail cotton grass, big tufts of that. So even though we weren't seeing a whole load of deer grass or purple moorgrass or bog myrtle or a whole load of cross-leaved heath, that group, those four, was not clearly represented. But what we were seeing is loads of tufts of hairtail cotton grass. So straight away has to be bog. That. And the fact that it's got bell heather in it makes it a pretty interesting thing, because bell heather does like these dry places on the whole. So it's always fascinating to see unusual combinations of plant species. Bell heather growing in a bog. Then this is another finding of the same thing. The previous one was on the Isle of Skye, and this one's in Northern Ireland. So this is one of a number of photographs I took of it. I was there and I found all this bell heather and growing, well, bits of bell heather growing in the bog, and thought, got to get some photos of this. It was a tricky one. Someone has pointed out it's slightly unfair. I'm sorry. Just I suppose to make the point that some things, they're quite rare occurrences, but that doesn't mean that they just don't occur, because they're rare and we do find them occasionally. And then a quick whiz through some other plants that we find in bogs and wet heaths, because I've been focusing on the main species, combinations of main species, including some of the mosses as well. Sundews, the round leaf sundew, by far the commonest of them, unmistakable thing with those leaves. like that. It has a little spike, a little cluster of whitish flowers in the flowering time, but the leaves are the most distinctive. And there are a couple of other species that have got narrower, longer and narrower leaves that are not so common. Bog asphodel, easy thing to tell because when it's in flower, it's like a yellow orchid. When it's not in flower, we've got that flattened spike of leaves that look like iris, but they're much, much smaller. And the flower spike stays on through the winter. This pale brown color, it lasts for ages. Always easy thing to tell. Grows in the wetter bogs and in quite a lot of the wet heaths as well. It doesn't grow much in the drier bogs, so the thick with heather and hairtail cotton grass. There's just not enough room for it to grow in there because it's quite a wee little thing. Okay, and the next page has got those gorse species. I said there'll be a page just showing those. Ordinary common gorse on the left, western gorse in the middle, and then the dwarf gorse, which is a scarcer, some more strictly southern species on the right. Although there's isolated populations of it in Nottinghamshire and in North Cumbria. Very odd, especially in North Cumbria. Anyway, they can all occur in dry heaths and in wet heaths. And there are, I won't go into the different details of the differences between the species and technical terms, but by far the commonest is the ordinary gorse on the left. Nice plants. So the western gorse and the dwarf gorse flower in late summer, and the ordinary gorse flowers quite a wide span of time through the year. Great plants. You don't get them in bogs, really, the gorses. You might find the odd tiny bit here and there, but basically they're not bog plants. So that's another thing. If you see heathy stuff looking like wet heath or bog and it's got any kind of gorse in it, probably ain't going to be bog. Okay, next slide is showing some grasses. The bristle bent. We've gone over 2 slides. The bristle bent on the left is, I mentioned a little bit back, it's a strictly southwestern species. Very thin, wiry leaves, making it look a bit like the wavy hairgrass, which is much more common, really widespread. And there's a wavy hairgrass flowers in the middle, which is a very wide spreading inflorescence, wider than the one of the bristle bents. Bristle bent leaves are stiffer as well, rather different looking thing. They both grow in dry and wet heaths. The wavy hairgrass grows in bogs as well. Actually, can get more abundant when the bog's being burned. So it's and in fact they both do well where there's been some burning. Hence, you can see the charred bits of old heather on the in the background of the bristle bent photo. So yeah, that shows those grasses that we can find in these wet heaths, and the bristle bent is one that's a particular southern species of mainly heaths, wet and dry. So it's quite a notable plant really where it occurs. The next slide's got some more widespread herbs. Heath-spotted orchid, very common through all kinds of wet heaths, and the tormentil likewise, and lastwood again, very common and widespread in wet heaths and getting into bogs as well. And on the next page are some sedges. There are a few species, 5 species here, which we find in wet heaths and in bogs. The bottle sedge and the bog sedge are basically in bogs, not really wet heaths. The other ones on the left and the far right can be in either in bogs or wet heaths. I'll not go into the details of those, but they're there for you to look at, to check out if you want to. Common species of sedges. Well, the bog sedge is not very common, actually. We said that's always a nice find. The final one, well, almost final one on the next page, is what we call the negative indicators. It's the same list for bogs and wet heaths. Young trees of birch and pine or other conifers are down officially as negative indicators, although in some places actually they may be a desired outcome if people are trying to get new woodland going somewhere and they've reduced grazing to get more natural regeneration. Especially birch or pine in the native pine zone. Somebody's asked, is the wavy hairgrass on bog? Does that mean it's raised bog? No, it can be blanket or raised, absolutely. What we find is it especially can get really abundant if there's been a burn, made it a little bit drier. But yeah, equally blanket bog and raised bog, that one. Thistles, nettles, they're down as negative indicators. We don't tend to see huge amounts of thistles and nettles in bogs and wet heaths, really. But if we did, yeah, it would indicate some kind of nutrient enrichment or a disturbance of some kind. Tall tufted rushes, they do occur naturally, but rather sparse. So more naturally, they're more in places where there's a bit of water movement, like along a stream that's running through a bog, or a bit of flushed wet heath, but not really thickening up that much. And in terms of if there was anything negative about them, that would only really apply to soft brush Juncus effusus in places where maybe the ground had been a bit disturbed by vehicles or trampling by livestock. And the soft brush locally can benefit from that and increase a bit. And at the very end, we've got some more questions in the form of combinations of, this is one question really, of species. We've got 8 different species mixes here. If you imagine vegetation composed of these different mixtures, and only one of them is bog vegetation, and one of them is neither bog nor wet heath. And I won't dwell for too long on this because some folks have had to go anyway because we've been over time with a bit of a late start. If we go on to the answers, they're mostly wet heath, but the one that's got the hairtail cotton grass is bog, and number 7 with heather and cladonia lichens, that's got nothing in the way of wet heath bog indicators. So that could just be a dry heath. That will just be a dry heath. The next, we have got 1 or 2 little more pictures. This one was a question again, actually. What would you call that? It's got loads of cross-leaved heath and bog rosemary. Well, I say loads, there's not much in that picture, but if you imagine that extrapolated on a bigger scale. So we're looking at stuff, there's a lot of sphagnum as well. That's the little sphagnum, that's Sphagnum capillifolium, the little red one. And there's bog rosemary and cross-leaved heath occur in good quantity in this place, wherever it is. What kind of fine-scale habitat do we think that one is? And we can give it just a few more seconds, and there we are. It's going to be bog because that bog rosemary is a pretty good bog indicator, especially for a raised bog. So, and in fact, this is the place where it was taken. There's somebody's written in the raised bog question mark. Obviously typed really quickly just after we changed to this slide, don't you think? No, I don't think so. I think that's genuine. It takes a little while for the thing to come through to the chat thing. So yes, correct, raised bog. In North Cumbria, there's a lot of raised bogs there with lots of bog rosemary in them. And there's also in some of these, actually see in the front of that photo, this little pale, little sedgy thing with, it's a slow typo, yes. So if you had typed it so quickly as to do it after that that photo had come up, then I think that would be compliments anyway for the speed of typing. So either way round, you're a winner. See that stuff at the foreground of that with those little white blobs? The next page has got a close-up of that. It's a thing called white beak sedge. And it grows, especially in the wetter parts of bogs, occasionally maybe in the wettest parts of little flushed wet heath too. Nice little thing. Princospora alba, the white beak sedge. So one of the many plants is typically grown with bog asphodel there. I think there's a wee flower of cross-leaved heath behind the bog asphodel. It's the right kind of pink anyway. So that's us about at the end. One more slide, and there we go. Just a picture. It's nice to have a picture. There's some bog and wet heath in there too, wet and dry heath. Dry heath in the foreground, up in the north of Sutherland. And yep. So thank you for for coming along to this session and being your patience and your interest and questions you've asked and so on. Hope it's hope it proves useful.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you again for your patience at the start there, but a lesson has been learned. Don't move desks after you do your practice with Ben. That's my that's my big lesson today. But that was really, really interesting. Thank you, Ben. And also thank you so much, everybody, for engaging. I was going to say, are there any questions at the end? And actually, I can't believe how many questions we've had throughout, and they've been really, really great questions. I think you'd agree, Ben. We've had some really great ones. If you have got 5 minutes, Ben, if there are any other questions, please do pop them in now. Oh, I'm glad, Nafi, that was a nice treat over your lunchtime. It was, wasn't it? And some absolutely beautiful photographs as well, Ben.
Thank you.
So Anna, yes, Ben, Anna's asked, is Ben doing any more of these? And he certainly is. So actually on Monday, Ben will be looking more closely at wet heaths and the species within and helping us to identify those. So you can find the link to that. I've actually popped it in a little bit earlier. I can actually copy it again if that would be helpful. It's up there. Hang on, let me have a look. So yes, Ben will be looking at wet heaths on Monday, and that's at lunchtime again at 1 o'clock. I will pop the link in now. I'm just double checking there are no more questions before we head off. Oh, I can see that Martin, you have asked a question. You ready for this, Ben? Can bog that has transitioned to heath by burning, for example, regenerate back to bog? And if so, is there any ways to tell that this is occurring? For example, a lack of sphagnum perhaps, but occasional hare's tail.
Yeah, there's a lot of bog restoration work going on with quite a bit of success in many places. So if it's so like damming drains is one of the main things, and that can lead to bog vegetation becoming heath vegetation in the end on a deeper peat. And there is success slowly. You know, it's rather a slow process. To gradually get more sphagnum going and a bit more growth of hare's tail cotton grass if there are only bits and bobs of it left. So yeah, there is stuff that can be done, and there's quite a lot of work up and down the country and in Ireland going on to restore bogs that have been drained and burnt and have got dried out that way. Yeah, there is stuff that can be done. Yeah. If it's got really horrendously dried out, I think there is going to be a limit to how brilliant we can expect it to get back. It might have been a wonderful bog before and lost the whole rich diversity of bog species, and we wouldn't set the bar too high in terms of what we would hope we would get in years to come. But still, yeah, there is a chance of getting bog vegetation, and there's work that's showing good results. The one about this where it's stripped,
just in case anybody's not reading that, I can just to reiterate. So that Marie's asking, the photo that we saw of the peat and the vegetation totally stripped, is that restorable or too far gone?
It will revegetate. Probably initially with things like tussocks of hare's tail cotton grass and common cotton grass, those species, and bits of heather, into a species poor bog, and eventually sphagnum species will come in there as well. So yes, it will revegetate, but there's no guarantee that we'll get it back anything like as good as it was before. But it can be expected to revegetate to vegetation that we would classify as bog, if only on the basis of hare's tail cotton grass. But that's no excuse for these guys to go stripping the peat, of course. Definitely not.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. And I agree with you, Anna. This has been fantastic, and I wish I'd known a lot of this before as well. Actually, so that's really useful. I have just popped in those links to Ben's future webinars with us. So there's 2 coming up. There's one on Monday on, as I say, wet heath. But Ben will also be taking a close look at montan acid grassland with us as well. And I believe that's on the 22nd of July, so a little bit more notice there for that one. But we have quite a few other webinars coming up, so do take a look at our online webinars on that page of the MPMS website. And as I say, we have recorded this, so it will be going up onto YouTube. It'll probably be at the beginning of next week now. So just to go back and refer to it later, because I know there was a lot of information. And yes, Catherine, the future webinars will be posted on YouTube, because we've realised, of course, not everybody can make these live sessions. So we record them and we will be putting them all on YouTube as well. Okay, lovely. No problem. Thank you so much, everybody. And good luck getting out on your bogs or wet heath or whatever you end up deciding that they are. And thank you so much, Ben. That's really, really been brilliant.
Thank you. I'm very happy to help.
Great.
Okay.
Right. Close this now. Thank you ever so much, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.